So, Jason, let me throw a phrase at you. Entropy-aware governance.
Yeah, I think that it's an idea that I'd like to put out there.
Okay.
So, Tim, if I were to say to you, if you went over a bridge with a heavy vehicle,
Okay.
and the way that you had confidence in going over that bridge was based on a label that said, mostly safe, you probably wouldn't feel good
You might not
about
drive
going over
over
that
it.
bridge.
Yes.
So in other words, like weak categorizations of safety limits, right? But that's exactly what we do. Like, it's exactly what we do in security most of the time, especially when it comes to authenticators. You know, we've had an episode, a famous one where we've talked endlessly about multi-factor authentication. We talked about not all MFA are created equal.
Yep.
And, what's interesting about all of those MFA and how they're not equal, what's a really good way of actually measuring them is what came to my mind. And I went back to a really old idea, which is let's actually measure these things by entropy, so that what would you prefer that bridge to have on its label? What you'd prefer to have is an actual stated load limit.
Right.
Above this weight, don't use the bridge.
Right. And then you know what you weigh, you know if you can use the bridge or not.
How about with authenticators? You know the actual entropy. So let's tie entropy to identity for a moment.
Okay.
Entropy is become sort of a complicated and confusing word because it's been used in a few different ways depending on which field you're in. The oldest and the original usage of the term was in thermodynamics, where basically the word entropy was part of bookkeeping of energy loss. Right. Anywhere in the universe where there's energy loss, you could actually talk about it with respect to its entropy. Claude Shannon is the one who could be blamed for making it a bit more complicated, because he took that really, really great idea and he actually started applying it to information, which is what's interesting to us. And that's why you and I have talked about the word entropy many times in this podcast, because the entropy of how a private key is generated is incredibly important.
Yes.
And, right. And if you don't have enough entropy, you don't have a good secret.
Yep.
Is the idea. So let's now tie this to identity and try and make a single sentence that kind of sums it up.
Okay.
Identity and entropy are related.
Yes.
In the sense that your trust of that bridge and your trust of the legitimacy of a stated identity. And identity is really all about reducing entropy.
Okay.
That's what it's about. In other words, it's about the squeezing the uncertainty out of the universe of the identity itself.
Sure. The identity of itself needs to be at zero entropy.
Exactly. How it's generated.
Yes.
A good secret, a good identity needs a lot of entropy.
Yeah.
Because, and this is probably the best way to state it. If you are going down a road and there's a fork in the road, the fact that there's uncertainty about, well, I have to choose one, and I'm not sure which one gets me to where I need to go. And so therefore, all right, well, I'll take this one. And if that didn't work, well, then I'll have to go back and take the next one. In other words, that's the problem of solving large prime numbers.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, there's so many forks in the road. There's so many points of intersection of, oh my God, there's multiple paths and I have to take all these paths. That's why multiple paths in creating the identity is good, because it makes it difficult for the attacker to be able to recreate the identity, because there's so many paths to have to take, right? In very simple English. But the identity itself should remove all possibility of there having be any forks of Tim Callan being Tim Callan. right? The identity, once it is formed, should have no forks in the road at all. It should be utterly the thing.
Right.
And so identity is all about squeezing uncertainty out of its universe. So it's interesting how entropy can be used in both of those ways. So how much entropy went into the secret is, I think, a better way to actually measure the thing. In other words, if you're using a password, you can absolutely measure the entropy of a password, because the statistical probability of you being able to guess it, right, within a certain number of guesses, or another way of saying it is, how many guesses would it take in order to be able to, how many permutations and combinations of the letters A, B, and C are there within a certain amount of password? You can explicitly state its entropy. Same thing can be said for a multi-factor authentication of just about any kind, of which the pinnacle of it would be a PKI certificate. And it's funny how in various kinds of guidance and even legislation, we actually state for PKI, private keys, certificates, etc., how much entropy there has to be. We choose key lengths, right?
Right.
But when it comes to things like, EIDAS identities and various forms of multi-factor authentication, we were like, good, bad, better.
Well, if you even have good, bad, I mean, most people seem to treat it as a simple binary, on or off.
Isn't it true? In other words, I have MFA, therefore I'm good to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's precisely what our last podcast was about. So this is just me trying to think a little bit harder and say, all right, if we really, really believe in this idea that not all MFA are created equal, and we'd like this to be encoded into, NIST standards or EIDAS or whatever, then is there a way to actually measure it?
You need a metric. You need an objective, measurable metric that you can apply to an MFA type. And then you need at least some degree of consensus that those objectives are right, that metric is actually meaningful. So, any thoughts on what that would be?
Well, I'll tell you what, Tim. Let's talk about how a measurement could be used. And there's a few components. Let's just talk about the components for a second, and we'll go on to the rest of the questions. Which is, one of the components is obviously the source entropy. For a password, it's basically what is the permutations and combinations will give a certain amount of entropy. For PKI, it's obvious. We know how it is because of the way that it was formed. So a source entropy is something that absolutely can be measured, and that's not really a problem. But there's also leakage of entropy. In other words, you and I have talked about side channel attacks. In other words, if you are assuming that a piece of hardware that's, has a random number generator is operating, and somehow there's a side channel attack that's possible against it. And this is very important for secure enclaves where we put secrets. In other words, we can measure that by not just an assumed source entropy, but we can start measuring leakage of entropy as well. And so regardless of how the entropy is leaked, it's at least part of our equation. And then I think as part of when you're encoding these things in guidance, one of the things that you could do if you're doing a post-mortem of a successful attack, one of the most common ones is credential harvesting, which is essentially a major form of entropy leakage, if you will.
Okay.
But I would say that if you're thinking about entropy from the sense of the source, its leakage. There's also another way of thinking about this, which is downgrade attacks. So in other words, if you like banks, for example, do this quite often in business to consumer situations. And it's, I brought up EIDAS a moment ago. Quite often, if you're attesting to your own identity, you can do it through, if it's the very first time, you obviously need very high entropy sources, hopefully, is what's available to you. But in order for you to have convenience, maybe somebody lost their account or whatever it is, there is this possibility that not just a credential harvesting, but there can be a downgrade attack. In other words, a bad guy can utilize the system as it was designed in order to be able to get around the system by calling up customer support and saying, hey, I lost my account, and be able to impersonate the person that they're attacking. And there are many forms of downgrade attack in cybersecurity. And when I think about all that, it's like, it's all codable by entropy. And so therefore, why are so much of our cybersecurity governance today written as mostly secure, sort of secure, really secure, when it really should be, let's actually write on the tin what the measurable entropy is.
You mean like number of bits?
You know what? I think what you could come up with is a threshold.
Okay.
In other words, take a look at the scenario that you are dealing with. Is it what are you worried about? Fraud? Are you worried about, somebody's going to get into my social media account, right?
So you're saying, like in the case of the bridge, you say, this bridge holds 20,000 pounds. This bridge holds 40,000 pounds. You literally would say, for this use case, this is the minimum entropy level.
And so the way it could be represented using that exact analogy is a sign that has no words on it, that has a picture of a great big truck and a line through it, implies the weight limit is not sufficient for a big truck. I think we could have something similar saying, don't use this for anything that risks fraud, anything that risks, other things that are higher risk than just your minimum cases. And therefore, I don't think you have to confuse people with entropy bits and have people have to interpret that, because that'll never fly. But just like on a bridge with that sign that says no big trucks, we can do the same thing and have it, the underlying reason for that sign, to be actually measured in bits.
Right. Yeah. The fact that the sign just says no big trucks doesn't mean nobody knows what the actual expected weight limit of the bridge is.
The engineer who designed the bridge knows exactly the number of bits.
It's just correct. So similar thing here. There would still be an aspect of saying we're going to count the bits, but then it gets translated into something you say is human interpretable.
And so where does this become useful? I think, EIDAS with their high, low, medium, when you're selecting credential authentication form factors, the sum totality of how hard would this be for an attacker to game the system somehow, or break it or bypass it, can actually be measured more like the way we measure the weight limit of a bridge, and less like rules of thumb, or worst case scenario, binary type decisions that lose information, which is what our podcast of Not Every MFA is Created Equal was all about.
Yeah.
So it's just a thought, Tim. And I think that we might have another episode down the road where we flesh this out further.
Yeah.
But I think this comes under the title of Entropy-aware governance.
Sure. Right. Entropy, absolutely. Governance, it's aware of the amount of entropy.
Yeah.
All right.
There it is, Tim.
Thanks, Jason.